Welcome to the third lecture in the series on universal wisdom in the Egyptian African tradition. In the previous two lectures, we discussed the sources from which the ancient Egyptians derived their knowledge and wisdom. There were two waves of immigration from Atlantis, and the third, the final one, from South India. This gave rise to a superior culture based on very ancient, universal knowledge and wisdom. We discussed some tangible results of this culture, namely the Great Pyramid, built by immigrants from Atlantis over 80,000 years ago, in which superior knowledge is clearly enshrined, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, containing esoteric knowledge about the processes of death and initiation. Last week, we outlined the mystical relationship between the Great Pyramid and the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Great Pyramid can be seen as a simulator in which initiates were prepared for higher initiations, but also as an initiation temple in which the initiate actually went through the higher initiation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead can be seen as a description or manual of the processes of death and initiation. Now we were asked where more information can be found about the plates and texts of the Egyptian Book of the Dead in the version of the Papyrus of Ani. The answer is simple. In the webshop on our website, blavatskyhouse.org. There you will find the booklet entitled Initiation in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Study of Traces of Theosophia in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Currently only available in Dutch, but it will also become available in English later this year probably. The study provides insight into the mystical nature of the ancient Egyptian religion, and it also reveals analogies with the ideas in other traditions, such as Buddhism, Christianity, and Hinduism. And you may also come to realize that much more of ancient Egyptian culture can be found in our contemporary culture than you might have ever realized. Today, we will consider the basis of the wisdom religion of ancient Egypt, usually referred to as Hermetic philosophy. One of the masters said the following about Hermetic philosophy and the Theosophical Society. The Theosophical Society is a philosophical school constituted on the ancient Hermetic basis, and he added, Hermetic philosophy is universal and unsectarian. That is, it suits every creed and philosophy and clashes with none. It is the boundless ocean of truth, the central point whither flows and wherein meet every river, thus every stream, whether its source is in the east, west, north, or south. In short, Hermetic philosophy, like modern theosophy, the synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion, can be seen as an expression of universal wisdom or Theosophia. Now, the term Hermetic philosophy is sometimes used differently than I just described. More than 2,000 years ago, a fourth wave of immigration and a mixing of cultures took place in and around Egypt. That's an interesting period for us, those 2,000 years, which is an average period between two lives. That is why it's likely that many of you feel drawn to the philosophy of 2,000 years ago and perhaps even lived in or around Egypt. It is precisely the philosophy from that period that is often called Hermetic philosophy in scholarly circles. But hopefully, with my brief explanation, I've already suggested that Hermetic philosophy is much older and above all universal. If we look at the history of around 400 BC to 480, we see first the heyday of Greece with philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato, who had learned much of their wisdom in Egypt. Then Alexander the Great expanded his empire into India, and a merging of cultures arose in the so-called Hellenistic period. Many religions coexisted relatively peacefully during that time. Many new religions were founded, often based on blended ideas. All these movements presented their own vision of wisdom. Consider the various schools that arose in Alexandria, for example, where Egyptian, Jewish, Greek, and Buddhist movements intermingled. Because Greek was the universal language in those days, wisdom was described with the Greek term gnosis, which means intuitive knowledge, in Theosophical terms, buddhimanos. Not solely intellectual knowledge, but the soul, the heart of it. As Pythagoras called it, knowledge of the things that are, of things in their innermost core. Thus, Hermetic philosophy was referred to as the gnosis of Hermes. This also included sciences such as mathematics, astronomy, astrology, alchemy, medicine, botany, architecture, hydraulics, and much more. To become somewhat familiar with the gnosis of Hermes, also often called Hermetics, we will explore some of the Hermetic writings today. These writings are based on the so-called books of Thoth and exemplify the profound knowledge of the ancient Egyptians. However, many of the original books of Thoth have been lost over time, but even the remnants reveal a universal wisdom. In modern-day Egypt, there are still people who practice the religion of ancient Egypt. These include the Egyptians who call themselves Baladi, often Muslims in appearance, but they can also be found among the Copts, essentially those who still have some ancestry with the ancient Egyptians. Now, the topics of the lecture of today are as follows. First, we will discuss what is the Hermetic tradition exactly. Then, next, universal wisdom in the literature of Hermes Trismegistus. And third, the influence and value of the Hermetic tradition. So, first we go address the question, what exactly is the Hermetic tradition? As we already explained in the first lecture, during the third class of human evolution, 18 million years ago, the faculty of thought, the mind, was awakened within humans. Theosophy speaks of the descent of the sons of mind. They inspired us by descending into our plane of consciousness and awakened the mind within us. In addition, all cultures around the world speak of 7 divine sages or groups of sages referred to as serpents or dragons of wisdom. Examples of names given to these divine sages by peoples include Thoth, Hermes, Osiris, Enoch, Orpheus, Mercury, and many others. And from these sages emerged a whole series of human teachers. And although the names differ, all peoples speak of the same divine and human sages and teachers. These teachers taught all the sciences, arts and crafts, including writing. The passing on of wisdom occurred from high to low, from gods to sages, to masters, to disciples, and to ordinary people. This is often called the Chain of Hermes. In Buddhism, the same phenomena is called the Guru Parampara, the succession of teachers. An example of such a line of succession in ancient Egypt was the line of initiated pharaohs of the first dynasties, roughly from 3000 to 2400 BC. Now the question is, who was Hermes and who was Thoth? As a brief introduction, I will give a sketch of Hermes by the author Édouard Schuret in his book The Great Initiates. I will then give some more explanation. So this is what Schuret writes about Hermes. Hermes is the name of a family, just like Manu and Buddha. He most simultaneously means a human being, a caste, a deity. Hermes, as a human being, is the first, the great initiator of Egypt. As a caste, he is the priesthood, the keeper of the hidden traditions. As a deity, the planet Mercury, which, according to its sphere, is related to a series of inspiring principles and divine initiators. So who was Hermes among the Greeks? And who, before that, was Thoth among the ancient Egyptians? To begin with the latter, the Egyptian god Tehuti of Memphis, later called Thoth by the Greeks, was in legend the god of learning and writing, and was the scribe and sacred bookkeeper or recorder of the gods, who expressed esoteric wisdom and who corresponded with the characteristics of the planet Mercury. Among the Greeks, he was called the god Hermes, among the Romans, Mercury. Interesting facts about Thoth or Thoth Hermes include that he was the Lord of Speech, the Lord of Divine Speech, through which divine ideas are manifested. He is the Lord of the divine books, such as the books of Thoth and the Book of the Dead. He was the scribe of the gods, the bookkeeper of karma, called the Lipikas in Theosophy. And for the individual, he meant the higher self, which is the judge of one's own thoughts and actions. The word thought not only means wisdom or intelligence, it also means assembly or school. Therefore, Madame Blavatsky says that in reality, Thoth Hermes is simply the personification of the sacred teachings of the priestly caste of Egypt, the voice of the great Hierophants. And Thoth or Hermes was never the name of one specific man, but a general title name, such as the term Neoplatonist was used in earlier times and maybe Theosophist is used today. In Greek mythology, we also see that Hermes is part of the trinity of Father, Mother, Son, namely Zeus, Maya, and Hermes. Hermes is then the manifested top of that hierarchy of life, which the Greeks refer to as the Logos. Thoth and Hermes have, among other things, the caduceus as an external recognition, a staff with two snakes around it, turning in opposite directions. Then there is the name Hermes Trismegistus, 3 times Great Hermes. Why 3 times Great? There are various ideas about this name. One of these is from George Mead, the close associate of Madame Blavatsky, who suggests the following. He said the Rosetta Stone contained already the term great to indicate a great sage or initiate, and that the term had to be surpassed by the term thrice great to indicate that Hermes is the personification of the universal wisdom. To summarize some ideas about the Chain of Hermes, 80 million years ago, human thinking began through inspiration from the sons of mind. Divine and human sages awakened the mind in man. Universal wisdom has been passed on ever since through the Chain of Hermes, and Hermetic tradition is the personification of universal wisdom. What did the wisdom of the Hermetic tradition consist of? As a coherent whole of religion, philosophy, and science, and what were its sources? In the first lecture, I briefly mentioned that its source is referred to as the East or the mystical East, and the meaning of this is that it concerns esoteric wisdom, occult knowledge about the non-material side of nature. In fact, we are talking about the esoteric wisdom of the fifth evolutionary class of human development, with Central Asia as its cradle, of which we are a part. More on that later. And for a long time, that esoteric wisdom, the wisdom of Thoth Hermes, was recorded in Egypt in the so-called books of Thoth, which have very ancient origins. The antiquity of the books of Thoth Hermes, Egyptologists are very cautious about determining the age of these books, although entire verses from them have been discovered on Egyptian monuments and tombs from the earliest dynasties. So their age dates back at least to the first pharaonic dynasties of about 3100 BC. However, based on the recorded observations of solar and lunar eclipses by the Egyptian priests, the age must be at least 10,000 years old. Based on Egyptian chronologies, it might even plausible that it concerns some 10,000 years of age. And an ancient Greek historian, Diogenes Laertius, from the time of Alexander the Great, even estimates the age of the Egyptian books of Thoth at 49,000 years. A tentative conclusion from all this is that the sources of knowledge of the books of Thoth Hermes must be sought in the first two waves of immigrants from Atlantis, with possible later influences via the third wave of immigrants from the south of India. Another question is, which Hermetic books have there ever been? According to the renowned Neoplatonist Jamblichus, Egyptian priests told him that there were once 20,000 books of Hermes. The Egyptian priest Manetho even mentioned 36,525 books of Hermes. The Christian church father Clement of Alexandria of the 2nd century claims that there were once 30,000 books in the library belonging to the team of Pharaoh Ramses II in Luxor. It is also called the Ramesseum, or the House of Life, which served as library, archive depot and scriptorium. Above the entrance of this library was written the telling inscription, "A cure for the soul." Clement further states that ultimately only 42 books remained, 36 on the history of all human knowledge and 6 medical books. One of these 6 medical books was rediscovered in 1872, the so-called Ebers Papyrus, named after the German archaeologist who discovered it. Its age is estimated at 16th century BC. All this clearly demonstrates that the Trismegistic books of the Hermetists in Alexandria, written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, represent really only a fraction of the actual Hermetic literature that once existed. If we look at the similarities between Egypt and the Far East, particularly ancient India, we see the following. Ancient India had the oldest tradition, first oral and later recorded in books, the Vedas, a word meaning knowledge. They are the oldest and most sacred works of the Hindus. Various sages contributed to them. The most recent version was compiled in 3100 BC by Vyasa. But the oldest versions of the Vedas are estimated to be 25,000 to 32,000 years old. So the Vedas also date back to the night of time. Moreover, it can also be found in the Theosophical literature that the Hermeses from Egypt in the distant past brought the mysteries from the Indian tradition to Egypt, but veiled and adapted them for the land of the pharaohs. Thus, the ethics of Gautama Buddha, Plato, Apollonius of Tyana, Jesus, Ammonius Saccas and his disciples are all based on the same mystical philosophy. And if you look at the contents and compare the knowledge and wisdom of, for instance, the Vedas from the East in the Hermetic literature, then you could come to the same conclusion as Ammonius Saccas did, the founder of the Neoplatonism in Alexandria in the 3rd century AD, namely that the teachings in the books of Thoth Hermes were identical with those of the Far East. Madame Blavatsky says the same thing about it. And I quote the Secret Doctrine. Thus it may be shown that all the fundamental truths of nature were universal in antiquity, and that the basic ideas upon spirit, matter and the universe, or upon God, substance and man, were identical. Taking the two most ancient religious philosophies on the globe, Hinduism and Hermetism, from the scriptures of India and Egypt, the identity of the two is easily recognizable. In short, the ideas of the East and the West are identical. By the Hellenistic period, so from about 330 to 30 BC, little remained of the books of Thoth in Egypt, and afterward almost everything disappeared. In 48 BC, the books were partly burned during the siege of Alexandria by Julius Caesar. In 390 AD, the remaining part was for a big part destroyed by Christians during the reign of Emperor Diocletian. And in 642 AD, the last part was destroyed by Caliph Omar. Of the original books of Thoth, however, one important original fragment has been preserved in its entire, known as the Emerald Tablet. We will discuss a section of that later on. To discover the grand scheme of Hermetic tradition, we should consider all the books that have been deeply influenced by Egyptian thought to determine which common truths they all, in other words, attempt to describe. Let's take a look at some examples of what remains of the literature of Egyptian thought. First, which I already mentioned, the Ebers Papyrus, primarily medical knowledge, was almost certainly among the original books of Thoth Hermes. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls, found near Qumran in 1947, the books of the Essenes, the Jewish sect that combined Egyptian, Greek, and Buddhist elements and was at the cradle of original Christianity. The books of Plato and Pythagoras and their students belong also in this row. They received their instruction in the Egyptian temples. Then the Nag Hammadi writings, discovered in Egypt in 1945. Books on the Gnostics from the 3rd century AD, including a number of Hermetic books. Then the Theosophia, an important Gnostic scripture written in Coptic. The books of the Neoplatonists from Alexandria, such as Plotinus, Iamblichus, etc., who openly based themselves on the Egyptian mystery wisdom. And from an Egyptian brotherhood dating back to Egypt's heyday comes an ancient Bantu scripture called the Sayings of the Ancient One, and this is an important philosophical source for the Bantu-speaking peoples of the African continent and for the so-called Ubuntu philosophy. More on that next week. Furthermore, little remains of the books of the Hermetists in Alexandria, which we can conveniently call the Trismegistic literature. Of the most important that remains, we can mention the Corpus Hermeticum, 13 short treatises, also collectively called the Pymander or Poimanders, named after the first part, the Asclepius, a conversation between Hermes, Asclepius' disciple, and others, and fragments collected by the philosopher Stobaeus in the 5th century AD, and finally the quotation from so-called church fathers and Greek philosophers. These works, in their present form, are merely recollections, more or less fake and sometimes incorrect, of various Greek or Latin authors who often presented their own interpretation as authentic Hermetic fragments. We now go to block 2, because now we are going to look at the contents of this Hermetic literature. And we will look at some examples of these Hermetic writings. But before we do that, I will briefly recapitulate, so to speak, touchstones to determine to what extent we can recognize universal wisdom in those writings, in those fragments we are going to look at. First, we have, of course, the fundamental principles of Theosophia, the boundlessness of life, of which all beings are a part. The second, every being has a boundless potential within itself and gradually unfolds these potentials. And third, inner unfoldment is cyclical and occurs through cooperation with other beings. These are the 3 fundamental principles of Theosophia. Then let's have a look at Kosmogenesis, the dawn of the cosmos and the role of the spiritual trinity of Father, Mother, Son, which we explained in the first lecture. Then the concept of anthropogenesis, the awakening of the mind in man 18 million years ago during the 3rd evolutionary class by the sons of mind. And finally, mysticism, the idea of the sevenfold composition of man, because that indicates the possibility of developing the divine within yourself through self-directed development, possibly accelerated through initiation processes with the motive of helping humanity. As a first test, we will have a look at the three fundamental principles of the Theosophia, and Madame Blavatsky, using examples from Hermetic writings, such as in the Pymander, demonstrates how much some passages have been distorted by Christian polishing, so to speak, but that they were nevertheless clearly written by philosophers with a more broader vision. And it is often evident that many writers favored already the concept of an anthropomorphic supreme being, so monotheism. And so note that in the following Hermetic texts, which I will quote, were quoted in the Secret Doctrine, and it is the first quotes are about the boundless life, and in that quotes, the boundless life is referred to as the universal being and God. So already anthropomorphic visions, but the texts are nevertheless simple, illustrative. So the first one is Hermes says that universal being that contains all and which is all, put into motion the soul and the world, all that nature comprises, says Hermes. In the manifold unity of universal life, the innumerable individualities, distinguished by their variation, are nevertheless united in such a manner that the whole is one, and that everything proceeds from unity. The next quote: God is not a mind, but the cause of the mind. Not a spirit, but the cause that the spirit is. Not light, but the cause that the light is. So, despite the questionable formulation from a theosophical perspective, both texts clearly echo the idea of the boundlessness of life. We go to the next principle. That is about the idea that every being has boundless potentialities within itself and can gradually develop these potentialities. The only remaining complete original text from the books of Thoth is the so-called Emerald Tablet of Hermes, and from it comes the ancient Hermetic saying, as above, so below. And the first lines of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes read as follows: True, without error, certain, most true. That which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, for performing the marvels of the cosmos. As all things are from the primordial one, by the mediation of one, the Logos, that is to say, the host of the Anchoans, so all things arose of this one thing by evolving. Its meaning is that everything emanates from that one thing, that is, from the divine top of a particular hierarchy of life in the cosmos. The Emerald Tablet expresses the law of analogy, as above, so below. Everything in the cosmos flows forth, emanates from the consciousness of higher developed beings. Furthermore, this text has been considered an important text for so-called alchemy for centuries. We will also look shortly at some text fragments in the Pymander which also confirm that man carries the divine within himself and that he is that divine in his deepest essence. Finally, from the three basic principles, the inner unfoldment idea that is cyclical and through cooperation with other beings. It is in the Hermetic literature described that the natural body of man cyclically descends into matter when it meets the heavenly man, that is, the sons of mind. In other words, the principle of cyclicity is also found in Hermetic literature. It is not my intention to discuss the entirety of Hermetic literature, known as the Corpus Hermeticum. It is far too extensive for that. Moreover, Madame Blavatsky warns that understanding the literature of the Hermetic tradition is generally no easy matter, even when it comes to the most lucid books. We will therefore limit ourselves to a few examples to show that the ideas of Theosophy can be recognized if you study on them in Hermetic literature. One of the best-known sections is the Pymander or Poimanders, the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum. Pymander means shepherd of man. The structure of the book Pymander is similar to that of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrines. Part 1 of the Secret Doctrine describes the Kosmogenesis, or the origin of the world, how various Hermetic philosophers and sages from other world religions have described it. And part 2 is about the anthropogenesis and describes how thinking humans came into being through the inspiration of the sons of mind, and also how we can recognize this inspiration within ourselves and open ourselves to it. In this way, we can turn inwardly to the source or spiritual core from which we emerged. Madame Blavatsky says of Pymander that it is a summary of one of the original books of thought summarized by a Platonist from Alexandria. In the 3rd century, this abridged edition was reworked based on ancient Hebrew and Phoenician manuscripts and was called the Genesis of Enoch. The Pymander is a dialogue between Pymander and a student who shows the student certain things as in a vision and then explains these things. But before I go to an example text, first I want to do a quick recap on Kosmogenesis. In the first lecture, we indicated that in all traditions, Kosmogenesis, or the origin of the cosmos, always begins with the Holy Trinity, which is designated in various ways: Father, Mother, Son, Father, Holy Spirit, Son, or Divine Thought, Breath or Voice, and Word. In summary, there is always a spiritual core or a source, the Father, that continuously emanates inspiration. There is a relatively material sphere, the Mother, into which this inspiration is projected. And there is a life germ, also a ray from the spiritual core, the Son, that is active in that spiritual sphere. In the first paragraphs of the Pymander, this idea of the spiritual trinity, after some study, is clearly recognizable, and I will give you the text soon. Now we go to the first vision of this Pymander. The Pymander, the personified divine thought, takes care that his disciple experiences a glimpse of the truth of the Kosmogenesis by means of a vision. And this vision can be described as follows. First, the disciple sees as a single entity a great light. It's called the nous. What is the nous? The nous refers to the universal mind. It is the highest thing a man ever can know. Then he sees that same light plus darkness. So we are now talking about the duality. And from that darkness, a sound, a voice resounds. Then, from that first light, a logos, the Greek word for word, emanates, radiates into the darkness. And so there is a threefold nature. Through this manifested nature arises in that darkness, through the agency of that logos, the first manifested nature, including human nature. And I'll give you now the first text, which you can also find back in the Secret Doctrine. And I quote. So Pymander is going to speak. The light is me. I am the nous, the universal mind. I am thy God, and I am far older than the human principle which escapes from the shadow, the darkness. I am the germ of thought, the resplendent word, the Son of God. Some explanation here. Here in the Pymander, the Trinity is also beautifully expressed as the universal thought, nous, as the Father, and the voice or the sound in the darkness, the Mother, and the Word, the Son. And then Pymander continues to the disciple, all that thus sees and hears in thee is the verbum, the word of the Master. It is the thought, Mahat, which is God, the Father. So, small explanation. The thought, nous, is the Father, and the word, the Son. And they are mentioned here in this quotation as one. In other words, this text can be interpreted that man carries the divine within itself, that he is that divine in his deepest essence. Then we move on to the second vision. There the disciple sees nous, that one great light from that first vision, no longer as a uniform entity, but as a vast host of countless beings, of powers, as he calls them, an enormous hierarchy of spiritual beings. And from nous, now dual, called light and life, emanates a second ray called the forming nous, the nous demiurgus, a hierarchy of builders of forms, of bodies, of the lower aspects of something. And then Pymander says, thought, the divine, which is light and life, produce through its word or first aspect the other operating thought, which being the God of spirit and fire, constructed 7 regions, enclosing within their circle the world of senses, named fatal destiny. This destiny refers to karma, and the 7 circles are the 7 planets and the 7 planes of the 7 cosmic planes. The construction of the outer bodies of man derived from those 7 rulers of the 7 planetary spheres occurred in the first 2 of humanity's 7 phases of growth on this planet. Mystically speaking, this is the story so far of the phases of development humanity has gone through in this planetary life before its mind became active. Then we move on to the 3rd vision in the Pymander, often called Anthropogenesis, but which actually describes the 3rd phase of humanity's development in which man truly begins to think. How does this work? From the universal mind, nous, light and life, a 3rd emanation now emanates, namely anthropos, man. So to sum it up again, there are 3 visions, and they are subsequently described as 3 emanations from nous. The first emanation is the logos, the word. The second emanation is the forming nous, the builders of forms. And the 3rd emanation is anthropos, man, the human being. And I give another quote. Thus says Pymander, and I quote also from the Secret Doctrine, "This is the mystery that to this day was hidden. Nature, that is the physical body of primitive man, being mingled with the heavenly man, Elohim or Dianis, brought forth a wonder. 7 men, or all males and females, hermaphrodite, according to the nature of the 7 governors, or the 7 hosts of the Pitris or Elohim, who projected or created him." So, the heavenly man refers to a group of beings who in their previous lives on planet Earth had become perfect humans, perfect thinkers. In Theosophy, this group of beings is called the Elohim or the Sons of Mind. In Jewish literature, this group is called the Heavenly Adam, especially in the Kabbalah. The heavenly man beings who are 1 kingdom ahead of us, just as we are 1 kingdom ahead of the animals. These anthropos, these sons of mind, like their brother, the formative nous, also seek to form. They connect with the 7 governors, with primitive physical man who cannot yet think. And from that connection arises the realm of the thinking human. This leads to the 3rd phase of growth of humanity, which we called the Lemurian phase in the first lecture. In the final section of the treatise, Pymander explains that the disciple can purify, ennoble himself, and realize the divine within himself. At the end, Pymander finally asks the disciple, "Why then do you delay? Should you not, now that you have received all knowledge, all gnosis, become a guide for those who are worthy, so that through you, humanity, through the divine within you, may be saved?" And here, the aspect of compassion and becoming a teacher clearly emerges. There are many other interesting passages in Hermetic literature. One of these concerns Hermes' prediction that true religious awareness will fade away in Egypt. I don't want to exclude you from this nice text, It is included in a dialogue between Hermes and his disciple Asclepius. It runs as follows. Art thou not cognizant, O Asclepius, that Egypt is the image of the heavens, or rather, that it is the projection here below of the order of things above? Yeah, to tell the truth, this land is a temple of the cosmic scheme. However, there is something that thou shouldst know, since sages ought to foresee things. A time will come when it shall appear that the Egyptians have worshipped the divinity so piously in vain, and that all their holy invocations have borne no fruit and are unheard. Divinity will then leave the earth and return to the heavens, abandoning Egypt, its ancient home, leaving this land bereft of religion and widowed of the presence of the god. Foreigners will cover the soil, and not only will holy matters be neglected, but still more, terrible religion, piety, and the worship of the gods will be forbidden and punished by law. Then this land, made holy by so many temples and shrines, will be covered with tombs and filled with the dead. O Egypt, Egypt, there will remain of thy religion only obscure legends which posterity will refuse to credit. Words engraven upon stone will alone remain to testify to thy devotion. How remarkably this prophecy has come true. Yet Hermes, the supposed speaker, foresees better times in the sequel of this prophecy, when divinity will once again return to Egypt. That's an appealing prospect. A brief summary of and comparison of Hermetica with the fundamentals of the universal wisdom. First, when we look at the boundlessness of life, then we see that Hermetics also assumes the universal unity of all life and therefore also of humanity, the connectedness of all beings, universal brotherhood, and also in the cosmos that there is order, there is harmony. Also, you can recognize the idea of the equality of all beings. Man is the microcosm of the macrocosm. Man's deepest core is divine. Man can ascend through gnosis and self-transformation based on the principle of compassion. And finally, the cyclic embodiment of all beings. We now move to the third and last part of the lecture, and that is about the influence and value of the Hermetic tradition. How did Hermeticism come to us in this century? How did Hermeticism spread through time and space? What was the influence of this Hermetic tradition the last 2000 years? In the 3rd century BC, a blend of different traditions emerged in Alexandria where religion, nationality, or race were irrelevant. The ancient Hermopolis, the city named after Thoth Hermes, served as a model for this way of living together. Over the centuries, various movements have consistently viewed Hermetics as the perennial philosophy in which the universal core of truth can be found. The idea of the universal unity of all life in particular is one of its most important core ideas. This core idea was further developed, particularly by the Neoplatonists in Alexandria in the 3rd century AD. See for more information the lectures coming April. In the following century, they and other movements were suppressed, partly due to the advance of Christianity. An exodus occurred to Arab-speaking countries and to Italy. Those who fled to Arab countries would eventually lead to a flourishing of Hermeticism in the famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad, now home to Islam, which flourished from the 8th to the 10th century. A large number of Hermetic books in Arabic also emerged there. Medical and alchemical texts were also given considerable attention. Hermeticism also exerted its influence on Sufism, as with Ibn Arabi in the 12th and 13th century with his Religion of Love, in which differences were always supposed to be bridgeable based on the idea of the unity of all life, and later in the 13th century with the mystic Rumi. In 1460, the Hermetic writings also reached Florence at the new Plato Academy founded by Cosimo de' Medici. At that time, Marsilio Ficino, commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, was already translating Plato's work into Latin. Ficino had to halt this immediately when it became clear that the Hermetic writings that were found might even be older, and he was commissioned to translate them. The translation would contribute to the strong impetus for the renaissance of classical wisdom. For Hermetic states that man has the ability, through self-directed development, to develop the divine within himself, and from this emerged a way of thinking that can be described as humanism. It had a great influence on important thinkers of the time, such as Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno. Bruno is famous for his expression, "All things are in the universe, and the universe is in all things." It is clear that the Roman Catholic Church, from that time onward, saw these ideas as a major threat. Bruno even paid for it with his life. Then we go to the 16th and 18th century. Further in Europe, Hermetics found its way into German-speaking countries. For example, in the 16th century, we see Paracelsus, a physician who pursued a holistic approach to medicine, considering mind, soul, and body in their entirety. He called Hermes the father of the philosophers. In Germany, its influence peaked in the 18th century with writers like Goethe, who studied Hermeticism in his youth, and Schiller. In England, in the 16th and 17th centuries, writers like Shakespeare, whose knowledge of Hermeticism resonated, and the philosopher and mathematician John Dee. In the early 17th century, when the Reformation was in full swing in the Christian Church, Hermeticism also came under fire. Students went underground, and so various secret societies emerged. They created documents of their Hermetic studies, in which their insights were presented in a veiled manner for protection. For example, the Rosicrucian Society, and later also the Freemasons in the 18th and 19th centuries, in both Europe and America. In the 19th century, in the US, there was also the movement of the Transcendentalists, such as Emerson, who claimed that true knowledge is obtained primarily through intuitive thinking and placed this above empirically obtained knowledge. Finally, at the end of the 19th century, we arrive at the founding in 1875 of the Theosophical Society from the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. In Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky provides more details about Hermeticism because Theosophy is based on a Hermetic foundation, universal and non-sectarian. And she effectively demonstrates that the remnants of Hermetic writings echo universal wisdom or Theosophia. The Hermetic tradition and Hinduism are the two oldest religious philosophies in the world and are identical in content. The fundamental truths of nature described in them are expressions of universal wisdom or Theosophia. The current value of the Hermetic tradition can be characterized as follows. 1. The universal unity of all life, and therefore also of humanity. It is most natural to live in harmony with the laws of nature and therefore to strive for harmony and solidarity. 2. The equality of all beings. Man is not dependent on forces outside himself. From the motive of compassion, he can develop his inner intuitive wisdom, gnosis, in a self-directed manner, instead of focusing solely on intellectual thought and on the physical world. Thus, through self-transformation, he can realize the divine within himself and become a teacher for his fellow human beings. 3. The cyclical embodiment of all beings. For lasting harmony, solidarity, and reconciliation are essential in the present. So, this was the lecture. We are now going to have a 3-minute break, and you can send your questions to via email or via the chat. After that, answering the questions, we will have a study of approximately 30 minutes. And if you want to join the study, you are most welcome. You have to send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org, and we will send you the link so that you can also enter the Zoom session for the study. So we have now a 3-minute break, and see you later. Welcome back all. Astrid, are there any questions?
Yeah, at the moment there is one question. What is the prayer of thanksgiving in the Nag Hammadi Hermetic text? Is there a connection to Ma'at?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the prayer in the Nag Hammadi scriptures. So I cannot react on that exactly. What I can say about the goddess Ma'at is that she actually represents the harmony in the universe. So that is what I can say about the goddess Ma'at, but I don't know, I'm not familiar with what the contents of the prayer in the Nag Hammadi scripture is. There is a chance that my colleague Barend Voorham, who will also join the study, knows the contents of this and that he can say something about it. But unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it. So maybe if the person who asked the question is joining the study, we can ask Barend Voorham if he knows something about it.
Another question came in. Is Pymander a dragon?
Well, I explained that in older traditions, the sages of old times were often called serpents or dragons. So in that sense, you can say that Pymander, the personified universal mind, can also be considered a dragon because he personifies this universal wisdom or universal mind. So he personifies the universal wisdom. So in that sense, you can call it a dragon.
Okay. Let me just check. No, no more questions.
No more questions. Okay, thank you for the questions. Unfortunately, one I cannot completely answer. Then we are going to switch over to the study part. We are going to conclude our study and our lecture of today. The lecture of next week will be, as I announced already, having the title I Am Because We Are Living by Ubuntu. So I will explain how Ubuntu emerged in ancient Egypt and became till this day a living philosophy who has its roots in ancient Egypt. And I will give a lot of examples of that because it is something we also can learn from, because it is made very practical in African countries. We are now going to close with the Gayatri mantra, and it runs as follows. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.